Welcome back to your sanctuary after sundown, the subconscious classroom, where history whispers and the walls sometimes creak a little too loudly. Tonight, we won't be wandering across battlefields or empires. Instead, we're staying inside, home, where it's safe, or so we like to think. In this 7-part descent through architectural memory, we'll open the door to a darker kind of domestic life. One where collapsing tenements, smoldering curtains, and splintering beams reminded generations that their homes could turn on them. Thatched roofs became torches, chimneys became traps, and every ceiling was a quiet threat. You are no longer in your room. You're in a creaking hall in Victorian London, in a collapsing stairwell in New York, in a flickering candlelit bedroom where the wallpaper is flammable and the bed frame might not survive the night. Before we step too far into the floorboards, let us know what corner of time you'd like to explore next. And if you enjoy drifting through the shadows of the past with us, consider giving this video a like or subscribing so we can keep unearthing history's haunted comforts together. Now breathe deep. Don't mind the draft. The house always groans before it remembers. Let us begin. Part 1: Creaking Floors and Crumbling Confidence. There is a quiet terror in the places we consider safe. For walls and a roof, we build them to keep the dangers out. But what if the greatest threat was already inside? For much of human history, the home was not a sanctuary. It was a gamble, a structure slapped together by hand, often with guesswork, desperation, or outdated techniques. And once the doors were shut, you weren't just tucked in, you were trapped. From medieval Europe to Victorian London, homes were not designed for long-term reliability. They were patched together with cheap materials, flammable fabrics, and wildly untested architectural ideas. Safety codes? Not even a fantasy. In fact, the idea that a home should be safe is an invention barely older than the electric toaster. But we start our journey somewhere older. Picture 14th century England. The Black Death had swept through just decades prior, thinning populations and reshaping cities. And as towns slowly began to regrow, builders scrambled to meet demand. Timber became the skeleton of the house, with lath and plaster smeared over thin beams. Roofs were made of thatch, which may as well have been tinder. If your home caught fire, and many did, it wasn't the flames that got you first. It was the collapse. Thick oak support beams would split, twist, then fall like battering rams. Sleeping beneath one was a gamble every single night. Bed curtain fires were a surprisingly common cause of death. Candles sat too close to linen, or embers drifted from the hearth. In one documented case from 1472, a family in Norwich was burned alive when a single spark from their fireplace landed on a wall tapestry. No one made it to the door. Doors, mind you, weren't always reliable. Many were held shut by a bar or a wedge, or worse, were designed to open inward. Once a structure started collapsing, the pressure of the building made the door impossible to open. You might fumble at the latch, pushing with all your strength, while the roof came down like an executioner's axe. But perhaps the slow deaths were worse. If the fire didn't get you, the air might. Soot-filled homes were the norm for centuries. Chimneys were considered a luxury until the late 16th century in many parts of Europe. Before that, the smoke simply accumulated inside. It drifted upward, if you were lucky, or pooled along the rafters, blackening the ceiling and your lungs. In peasant cottages, children were often placed in hanging baskets or shelves above the hearth to keep them warm, directly in the smoke path. There's evidence suggesting that this chronic smoke exposure, especially in colder months, contributed to early respiratory diseases long before tobacco ever entered the picture. And this wasn't limited to peasants. In Tudor homes, even the elite found themselves coughing through winters. Queen Elizabeth I herself reportedly complained about the stench and smolder of hearths poorly drawn, though she likely enjoyed the best ventilation in the kingdom. Yet even in homes with chimneys, death lurked. Chimney collapses were shockingly common. The flues would build up with soot and become unstable, especially in damp climates. In 1653, a house in York collapsed after an overloaded chimney stack came loose in a storm. It dragged down an entire wall, crushing the family's sleeping quarters and the neighbor's livestock pen. The animals were buried alongside the family. Many chimney stacks were built without proper bracing. In fact, in 17th century Dutch cities, you can find records of fines imposed on builders for chimney looseness. The phrase was so common that it became shorthand for poorly made homes in general. Meanwhile, those lucky enough to live in early apartments, yes, multifamily housing existed as far back as ancient Rome and medieval Europe, often faced even worse odds. Roman insulae or tenement blocks were notorious for collapsing. Made of cheap brick and timber, and often 6 or more stories high, these buildings leaned on each other for support. Remove one wall and the whole street could collapse. And collapse they did. The Roman writer Seneca once joked that to sleep in the upper floor is to live in the sky, but die like a stone. It was common knowledge. The higher your floor, the cheaper your rent, and the closer you were to disaster. When the city of London burned in 1666, it wasn't just the fire that killed. Entire districts pancaked as buildings collapsed in on themselves. The fire spread so quickly because many homes were literally touching at the roof lines. Sparks leapt from thatch to thatch, timber to timber, as entire streets went up like bonfires. After the Great Fire, Sir Christopher Wren and others insisted on fire breaks, wider roads, brick construction, and slate roofs. But it would take decades for the cultural memory of wooden death traps to fade. Even then, innovation didn't always mean improvement. In 18th century Paris, a new obsession with apartment buildings brought with it new terrors. Builders started incorporating iron and stone in odd, untested ways. The result? Buildings that seemed sturdier until they weren't. One collapse in 1776 killed 12 people in Montmartre after an upper wall gave way during a rainstorm. Witnesses said the masonry flowed like flour, a reminder that even stone isn't safe when mixed with hubris and shortcuts. But structural failure wasn't the only danger. The house itself, its furniture, its textiles, its very walls, could turn on you. In wealthier homes, tapestries and draperies were signs of status, but they also trapped heat, stifled airflow, and caught fire with alarming speed. In 18th century England, it was common for beds to be draped in heavy curtains, not for privacy but warmth. This meant that if your candle so much as tilted, the whole bed might go up like a torch. And in winter, you slept close to the flame. In 1783, an entire wing of a manor in Derbyshire burned when the master of the house fell asleep reading by candlelight. The curtains lit first, then the canopy, then the bed itself. His staff barely escaped, and the local paper described the incident with alarming bluntness. The gentleman expired, wrapped in linen fire. Lest you think this was only an old world problem, consider early America. Log cabins in colonial towns were often riddled with gaps. Mud, straw, and moss were used as insulation, but dried out quickly. In the right heat, they became kindling. Floorboards warped and shrank with age, leading to uneven surfaces where candles could tip, children could trip, and rats could make nests. More than one death occurred when a ceiling gave out under the weight of poorly stored goods. Some families in New England recorded cracking beams as omens, not of ghosts or spirits, but of structural failure. These noises often preceded collapses, and without any centralized inspection process, It was up to the homeowner to decide what counted as dangerous. Many didn't know until it was too late. Even bathing could be deadly. Indoor plumbing was a luxury for the elite by the 19th century. But those early water closets and copper tubs had weight, a lot of it. Bathrooms were often installed on upper floors without reinforcing the joists beneath them. There are dozens of cases in 19th century London and New York where bathtubs crashed through the floor mid-soak. One newspaper in 1868 dryly noted that a woman found herself both cleansed and buried. And let us not forget stairs. Steep, narrow, often spiral in design, they were a daily hazard. The elderly broke necks, children cracked skulls, and drunks fared worst of all. In Dublin, 1832, a string of deaths prompted a newspaper to call for anti-slippage treatments for household stairs. The suggestion? Nail down coarse cloth or scatter gravel. Not exactly a revolution in safety. Even ceilings could turn treacherous. Decorative plasterwork, popular in Georgian and Victorian homes, was heavy and often poorly attached. Bits flaked off all the time. But entire panels? Those could kill. In 1854, a dining room ceiling collapsed mid-meal in a Glasgow home, instantly killing 2 servants and injuring 6 guests. The ceiling had recently been repaired. The house had eaten them, quietly, suddenly, without warning. And so the lesson becomes clear. For centuries, people didn't just live in homes. They risked their lives inside them. A home was not a sanctuary. It was an experiment, and it didn't always work. Part 2. The chimney that swallowed children. If a house had a mouth, the chimney was it. It belched smoke, swallowed fire, breathed warmth, and sometimes took lives. For centuries, chimneys were among the most dangerous features of any home. The problem wasn't just fire. It was the design itself. Tall, narrow, and dark, chimneys became architectural traps. Not just for adults, but especially for children. In early modern England, particularly during the Georgian period, the rise of chimney sweeps introduced one of the most horrifying and fatal domestic roles: the climbing boy. These were children, often orphans, street kids, or sold by desperate parents, trained to climb up and down the narrowest of flues. Some were as young as 5 years old. They were used not because they were fast, but because they were small. Full-grown adults simply couldn't fit into chimneys, which could narrow to just 9 inches wide. The job was lethal. Chimneys weren't just tight. They were filled with soot, sharp brick edges, and crevices that could snare a limb or crush a ribcage. A child might ascend halfway only to find the passage twisted tighter than expected. If they got stuck, there was often no rescue. Sweeps might try to tug them free with a rope. If that failed, the child simply died in place. One infamous case from 1788 involved a boy named Valentine Gray, who became stuck in a chimney in a London townhouse. His master, enraged by the delay, reportedly beat him with a stick from below while he was still trapped. Gray died of suffocation, and the incident became one of several to finally stir reform. The soot itself was deadly. Without protection, children breathed in thick carbon and creosote every day. Their lungs blackened, their skin blistered, and their knees and elbows were rubbed raw from scraping brick. Many developed what was known as soot wart, a form of cancer now recognized as one of the first occupational carcinogens ever documented. Sir Percival Pott, a British surgeon, formally identified the link between chimney work and scrotal cancer in 1775. His study remains a foundational piece of occupational health history, but change was glacial. It wasn't until 1875, nearly a century later, that the use of child sweeps was fully outlawed in the United Kingdom. And yet, even homes without climbing boys face danger from their chimneys. Because soot is flammable. If it built up too thick inside a flue, a stray spark could ignite the entire shaft. Once lit, a chimney fire roared upward like a cannon. A vertical explosion that shattered masonry, launched embers, and sometimes tore the top right off the house. London was notorious for these fires in the 17th and 18th centuries. You can find journals and city records detailing chimney roaring events, with entire blocks of tenements catching fire in succession, like matches tipped into one another. After the Great Fire of 1666, rules were introduced requiring chimneys to be swept regularly. But enforcement varied widely. Landlords cut corners. Tenants didn't always know, and soot built up anyway. In Paris, chimneys posed a different risk. Stone flues cracked over time, especially in older buildings where repairs were inconsistent. The cracks let in poisonous gases like carbon monoxide. In the winter of 1799, during a brutal cold spell, several families in the Marais district died mysteriously in their beds. It wasn't until investigators noticed that all the deaths occurred in homes with recent fireplace modifications that they traced the problem back to leaky chimneys. The very heat that kept them alive had also poisoned the air they breathed. Fast forward to 19th century America, and the chimney danger evolved but didn't disappear. Early industrial homes used coal instead of wood, and coal chimneys had their own risks. The dust was finer, but the heat was greater. Chimney stacks overheated and cracked brickwork. In New York City, several townhouse collapses in the 1850s were blamed on chimney failures. Once the central spine of the house buckled, the surrounding walls often followed. There's a term in fire inspection circles, the flue domino. When one chimney stack topples, especially in rows of connected housing, the chain reaction can bring down entire blocks. It's not just a theory, it's happened. But perhaps the most surreal and literal danger of chimneys lies in what or who got stuck in them. In folklore, chimneys were considered liminal spaces, in between zones where things could enter or leave mysteriously. That mythology found tragic echoes in the real world. In Germany, during the 18th century, there were rumors of chimney ghosts. Children heard crying in the walls, wailing through the smoke ducts. These were often dismissed as superstition. But when renovations were made in older houses, workers sometimes found bones. Tiny, soot-stained bones wedged in impossible corners. One particularly grim discovery occurred in 1883 in Manchester, England. A chimney sweep's apprentice had disappeared 30 years earlier, presumed to have run away. During a roof restoration, workers discovered his body mummified in a flue. He had died there, unnoticed, above the kitchen hearth, sealed in by bricks and silence. But children weren't the only victims. Adults fell prey to their own chimney decisions, too. In Italy, noble homes of the 16th century sometimes built secret passageways behind or alongside chimneys, the warmest part of the house. These passages were used by servants, lovers, or smugglers. Occasionally, someone would get trapped. In 1612, a court clerk in Florence was found dead in a narrow shaft behind a chimney he had tried to sneak through to avoid arrest. The cause of death? Starvation and embarrassment. The chimney, then, was not just a vent. It was a corridor of risk. Its presence dictated how people cooked, how they slept, how they cleaned, and how they died. And it wasn't just an old-world danger. Even in the 20th century, gas fireplaces and electric chimney fans brought new kinds of problems: electric fires, short circuits, carbon monoxide leaks, and house fires caused by improper installation. the house still had a mouth, and it still bit. Take, for instance, the American suburban boom of the 1950s. Homes were built fast and cheap. Many chimneys were purely decorative, yet people installed real fireplaces in them. Without proper flues, the walls overheated. Between 1955 and 1965, there was a spike in house fires in prefab neighborhoods across the Midwest, largely traced to chimney installations not rated for live flame. The irony? People wanted the look of an old-world hearth, without understanding the danger that came with it. Meanwhile, in colder parts of Scandinavia, chimneys took on yet another role: storage. Attic spaces near flues were often used to dry herbs or even store linens, since the heat would discourage mold. But accidents happened. In 1861, a farmhouse in rural Sweden burned to the ground when stored flax caught fire near a chimney vent. The family lost everything, and the fire spread to the neighbors' barns. People never learned. Even today, holiday traditions flirt with chimney peril. Every Christmas, countless fireplaces are lit across the Western world, often for ambience, not heat. Stockings hang dangerously close. Paper decorations dangle above open flame. Candles flicker unattended. Each year, dozens of fires are reported in December directly linked to seasonal chimney use. And yet we romanticize it. There's a deep cultural nostalgia for the hearth, a symbol of warmth, comfort, family. Literature speaks of gathering round the fire. Songs praise chestnuts roasting. We don't think of children scraping their skin on brick or suffocating in soot. We don't think of the dead chimney sweep or the gas leak or the crack in the flue. But the house remembers. The house always remembers. In every historic district, behind every restored brick facade, there is a story of someone who vanished into the wall. Some who burned, some who fell, some who never came out again. The chimney was not your friend. It was a shaft of ash and risk, a monument to our belief that warmth was worth any price. Part 3. When the ceiling cracked like thunder. The ceiling is the house's quietest lie. You look up at it every day and trust that it will simply stay where it is. But history offers a less comforting truth. Ceilings fall. They split open like rotten fruit. And when they do not care who's underneath. For most of human history, the ceiling was never a certainty. In fact, the very idea of having one was once a sign of privilege. Peasants and laborers often slept under open beams or even open sky. But for those who lived with the luxury of overhead shelter, the risks of collapse crept above their heads like patient predators. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as cities boomed and homes grew taller, ceilings became heavier, fancier, and more fatal. Gone were the days of simple rafters and cloth drapes. In their place came dense plaster ornamentation, wooden trusses, and in upper-class homes, elaborate coffered ceilings with intricate carving and gilded detail. Beauty came at a cost, and that cost was weight. A decorative plaster medallion in a Victorian drawing room could weigh as much as a child. Entire stretches of crown molding were sometimes installed with little more than wooden laths, old nails, and gravity. Water was the great saboteur. A small leak from the roof, left unattended, could drip for weeks into the plaster of a ceiling, turning it slowly to sludge. The wood supporting it would rot silently. Then, one night, usually during dinner, often without warning, the ceiling would fail. It wouldn't fall all at once. First, there would be a noise, a snap, a groan. Guests would glance up. And then, in one cold breath of gravity, everything above them came down in a single dusty roar. In 1850, A townhouse in Edinburgh hosted a formal supper for the gentry of the city. The walls were adorned with paintings. The cutlery was silver, but no one noticed the hairline crack spidering its way across the ceiling. By dessert, it had grown larger, and before anyone could raise an alarm, the entire ceiling gave way. Plaster, beams, dust, oil lamps fell like a second story collapsing, crushing the table beneath. 2 guests were killed instantly. The survivor accounts described the sound as thunder being born inside the room. There was something particularly cruel about ceiling failures in bedrooms. Families would lie down to sleep beneath a ceiling that seemed as still and eternal as the night sky. But if that ceiling was made from clay tiles, or if the joists had warped during a hot summer, or if mice had gnawed through just the right structural thread, then the collapse could happen in total silence. In rural Ireland, where many cottages used turf and thatch roofing layered over exposed beams, ceilings could mold or warp in winter. One 1846 account from a Donegal farmer describes the horrifying moment his child was buried under a cascade of rotting thatch, wooden struts, and debris when the ceiling collapsed at dawn. The child survived, barely, but the father never again slept under a roof without a pole nearby to test for weakness. It was not only domestic spaces that fell victim to their own overhead decorum. In sacred places, the fall of the ceiling was interpreted as something far greater than bad carpentry. Churches and cathedrals, heavy with vaulted ceilings and stone ribs, held their sanctity above the heads of congregants. In 17th century France, a rural chapel in Normandy saw its vaulted ceiling collapse during a wedding ceremony. The bridal party was crushed. Survivors called it divine judgment. Engineers later blamed a keystone that had shifted in a storm years earlier. Monasteries, too, carried this risk. With their tall arches and stone ribs, every misaligned weight became a hazard. Monks reportedly used to tap certain columns with sticks each morning to check for movement in the upper arch. If the echo rang wrong, they avoided that hall. Such rituals were born not of superstition, but survival. As homes grew taller in the 19th century, the ceiling failures moved vertically. Multi-story homes and apartments meant more pressure on the ceilings of lower floors. Add the introduction of cast iron stoves, bathing tubs, and heavy wardrobes above, and suddenly a ceiling bore more than chandeliers and plaster. It bore an upstairs. In New York in the 1880s, early tenement buildings regularly experienced partial ceiling collapses. Families would complain of drifting flakes or falling chips of plaster, but landlords often ignored the warnings. One account describes a woman sewing beside the fire when her ceiling cracked open above her and dropped the upstairs neighbor's bed, with the sleeping tenant still in it, into her living room. In Germany, between 1820 and 1890, civil engineers began studying stress patterns in ceilings, measuring the limits of wooden joists, the bowing of laths, the saturation points of plaster. But the average builder didn't read these reports, and the average landlord didn't care. In Berlin, a ceiling collapse in 1879 killed 3 and exposed an illegal upper floor that had been added without proper support. The attic, so often romanticized today, was historically a space of chaos and danger. Attics weren't designed for occupancy. They were for drying herbs, storing tools, or hiding debts. But as cities swelled and space shrank, people moved upward. They lived under the eaves, and every piece of furniture they dragged up their added weight that the ceiling below never signed up to bear. Fire damage was another silent ceiling killer. A fire in the lower floors of a building might be extinguished quickly, but the heat would travel upward, weakening beams. Weeks or months later, without further warning, the ceiling might fall. In post-fire inspections, This was so common that insurance inspectors in London began measuring ceiling sag as part of routine assessments. A drop of more than 2 inches in any section was considered a red flag. The problem? Few people called the inspector before it was too late. And then came modernity, new materials, new promises. Drywall replaced lath and plaster. But drywall, when installed without adequate joist support or when subjected to moisture, could fall in large sheets. In Florida, in the 1960s, a wave of ceiling collapses was traced to a specific brand of adhesive used to anchor ceiling tiles. The glue degraded in heat, and entire panels would release without warning. Mold crept in again as an agent of destruction. In basements, in bathrooms, anywhere moisture lived, the ceiling suffered. Mold ate through drywall, peeled paint, weakened insulation. Sometimes the mold was visible. Sometimes it wasn't until the ceiling came down like wet paper. And today, ceilings still fail. A ceiling collapse is one of the top unexpected insurance claims in many Western countries. Builders misjudge span load. Renovators overload beams. Tenants ignore signs of sag. And sometimes, just like in the past, it happens in the middle of dinner. If you hear a cracking sound above your head, don't assume it's nothing. History is filled with people who thought the same right before the sky fell in. Because when the ceiling comes down, it doesn't knock first. It just falls. Part 4. The floor that swallowed the parlor. We rarely think of the floor beneath us as capable of betrayal. It is supposed to be the one constant, the thing that holds us up. But throughout history, floors have proven they are more than capable of treachery. In fact, they have swallowed entire families, consumed parlors mid-conversation, and opened beneath feet without warning like a trapdoor into chaos. In ancient homes, the concept of a stable floor was more dream than reality. Dwellings were often built on uneven earth, packed clay, or loosely fitted stone. In Roman Insulae, the city's infamous multi-level apartment blocks, wooden floors groaned under the weight of crowded tenants. Archaeological evidence shows that floors were hastily constructed, often with mismatched joists and inconsistent materials. Roman historian Juvenal once quipped that in Rome, the higher the apartment, the cheaper the rent, and the greater the fall. In the medieval period, especially in England and France, wood plank flooring began to replace dirt floors in wealthier homes. But wood warps, and in damp climates, it swells and shrinks with the seasons, loosening its grip on nails and joists. Termites, woodworms, and moisture chewed from beneath. It was not uncommon for chairs to list at angles or for tables to slowly slide toward one end of a room. In Venice, entire palazzos were built atop wooden piles sunk into marsh. Over centuries, those piles softened or shifted, especially under rooms that stored water or wine. A diary entry from a Venetian steward in 1764 recalls the moment when a storage room floor collapsed, plunging 200 barrels of Chianti and the steward's apprentice into the Grand Canal. The apprentice lived. The barrels did not. But perhaps no era produced more sudden collapses than the age of overconfidence, the 18th and 19th centuries. With cities expanding and the middle class growing, homes were built faster, taller, and with less scrutiny. Builders reused wood, skimped on support beams, or ignored load tolerances altogether. In London, some parlors were given nicknames like the Wobbler or the Dipper because of their unmistakable slant. One 1841 report described a parlor that sank visibly when more than 4 people entered the room at once. Another, in Leeds, collapsed mid-luncheon when the guests stood simultaneously to toast a wedding. Dry rot became a silent menace. Caused by fungal spores and worsened by poor ventilation, dry rot turned solid beams into sponge-like husks. It moved slowly but inevitably, weakening everything it touched. One British homeowner in 1827 noted that he could poke his floor joists with a spoon. Days later, the kitchen collapsed into the crawl space, along with his wife's prized pantry. Meanwhile, in America, the expansion westward introduced homes to entirely new threats. Prairie-sod homes had floors made from beaten dirt and layered straw. After storms, the ground would shift, forming underground voids. In one 1863 case, a family in Kansas awoke to find their stove had vanished into the floor during the night, swallowed by the earth. City homes didn't fare much better. In New York's tenements, families crammed into wooden buildings where fire and water damage were frequent, and repairs were rare. A building on Pearl Street saw 3 separate floor collapses over 15 years. Each time, the blame was pinned on overloading. Too many people, too many boxes, or an iron stove too close to the edge. Even well-meaning households made dangerous miscalculations. Pianos, for example, became a status symbol in the 1800s, but a full upright piano could weigh 800 pounds. In Boston in 1874, an amateur composer installed his new instrument in an upstairs music room. A month later, during a winter party, the floor gave way. The piano fell through 2 floors. Miraculously, no one died, but the host's career as a composer ended shortly thereafter. In Australia, colonial buildings faced a different hazard: termites. White ants, as they were called, moved silently through beams and flooring, eating entire substructures before their presence was noticed. One Sydney tavern collapsed entirely in 1882. Investigators discovered the entire subfloor had been reduced to pulp, held together only by the carpeting. Even social gatherings became gambles. In rural communities across Europe and North America, haylofts were often used as informal gathering spaces. Dances, wakes, or even Sunday dinners were held above barns. But the floorboards were never meant for so many boots or so much stomping. One winter in 1893, a barn in Ontario collapsed under the weight of a Christmas dance. 32 people fell into the hay below. No one died, but the cows were reportedly never the same. Below some homes, forgotten wells or old cisterns posed invisible threats. In parts of rural England, stone-covered wells once used for water collection sat hidden beneath kitchens or pantries. Over time, the stone weakened. In 1901, a Derbyshire woman disappeared mid-laundry. When her husband entered the room, he found only a hole in the floor and the faint splash of water below. She was pulled out 2 hours later, soaked but alive, and never again did she do the washing alone. Floor design in the industrial era didn't always improve matters. Iron and steel introduced new forms of structural support, but only when used properly. In 1910, a department store in Chicago added a mezzanine level to increase showroom space. The new level was built with steel beams, but the flooring atop it was poorly braced. During a spring sale, the floor sagged under the weight of shoppers and mannequins. Then it buckled. 5 people died and dozens were injured. The mannequins, eerily intact, were mistaken at first for the dead. Even concrete, modernity's miracle, has betrayed us. Improperly mixed or cured concrete can crack under pressure. Reinforcement bars rust. Moisture seeps in. In 1968, the Ronan Point apartment tower in London partially collapsed when a gas explosion knocked out a structural wall. With no support beneath them, the floors above fell like dominoes. 4 people died. The disaster sparked a wave of inspections across Britain. Today, the floor beneath you is safer than ever. Building codes are stricter, materials are better, but accidents still happen. Basements flood and weaken supports. Renovators remove, Structural walls. Heavy furniture is placed in the wrong place. In Florida, in 2021, a condominium collapsed without warning, killing nearly 100 people. The cause? Years of ignored structural warnings, concrete corrosion, and water infiltration. We like to think of the floor as permanent, immutable, but history has shown over and over that the earth beneath our feet can vanish in an instant. So step carefully, and if your floor creaks more than it used to, or if the bookshelf suddenly lists, or if the ceiling below your bathtub starts to sag, remember, the house is teeth, and sometimes it bites from below. The bedroom is where we're meant to feel safest. The bath, a ritual of relaxation. But behind those closed doors, countless domestic tragedies have unfolded. These are the most intimate rooms in the home and, historically, some of the most dangerous. Let's begin with the bedroom. The bed itself, symbol of comfort, of privacy, was often a trap. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it was common for beds to be heavy wooden structures with curtains surrounding them on all sides. These bed curtains, while meant to keep in warmth, also caught fire with terrifying ease. A single candle set too close to a tassel could turn the bed into a roaring inferno in seconds. And once the curtains were alight, escape became nearly impossible. Women were particularly vulnerable. In the Victorian era, women's clothing was layered, voluminous, and highly flammable. Nightgowns brushed against embers or the candle on the nightstand. One British coroner's report from 1847 dryly noted that her linen caught light and she expired in flame before reaching the bell pull. Even when flames weren't involved, beds themselves were hazardous. Poorly constructed bed frames collapsed under their own weight, especially in multifamily housing. One case from 1883 involved a bunk bed in a Glasgow boarding house collapsing mid-sleep. The upper sleeper fell through, crushing the man below. The landlord claimed ignorance. The coroner called it negligence. The invention of spring mattresses didn't help much at first. Early versions squeaked, snapped, and sometimes stabbed. Metal coils burst from thin fabric and impaled sleepers. In New York in 1895, a boy died after a sharp spring punctured his lung during the night. His parents discovered him stiff and pale, pierced by the bed itself. In colder climates, people piled blankets and quilts so thickly that suffocation became a quiet killer. Infants were especially at risk. Before safe sleep practices were widely understood, babies were often swaddled tightly and placed in feather beds. More than one family woke to find their newborn had disappeared beneath the folds. Even the placement of the bed could become a fatal choice. It was common to sleep near the fireplace for warmth, but embers leapt, coals rolled, and fire guards were minimal. One rural family in Wales lost both their daughters to a bedroom fire started by a stray ember while they slept under a woolen quilt that ignited silently and burned fast. Moving from the bed to the bath doesn't offer much relief. The bath, as we understand it today, is a relatively modern invention. For centuries, washing was done in basins by sponge or in rivers. But as indoor plumbing crept into homes in the 19th century, it brought with it a host of unanticipated risks. First was weight. Water is heavy, 8 pounds per gallon. A full copper bathtub might weigh over 300 pounds when filled. When placed in upper rooms of older homes, they stressed floors built long before plumbing existed. Bathtub collapses were surprisingly common. In 1892, a woman in Philadelphia fell 2 stories with her tub when the bathroom floor gave out. She survived, but the tub left a trail of cracked joists, splintered lath, and broken dinnerware all the way to the cellar. Then there was the water itself. Heating it was often done with coal or gas-fired boilers. Poor ventilation led to an insidious killer, carbon monoxide. Entire families were poisoned during baths. In one 1908 case in Chicago, the father ran a gas heater while drawing a bath. He died slumped beside the tub. The rest of the family was found unconscious on the floor, overcome by fumes. The slipperiness of modern bathing environments was a hazard not yet fully appreciated. Enamel tubs, tiled floors, and wet soap created perfect conditions for deadly falls. In Paris during the Belle Epoque, hospitals recorded dozens of cases of concussions, spinal injuries, and fractured hips attributed to bathroom falls. One elderly gentleman reportedly died after slipping and hitting his head on a porcelain chamber pot. Bathing mechanisms themselves weren't safe either. Shower devices were often poorly constructed. Early showers were hand-pumped or gravity-fed from a tank above. These tanks occasionally fell. In 1911, a man in Berlin was crushed by his own water tank while attempting to adjust the temperature. Even bathtubs themselves had design flaws. Some featured overflow holes placed too high or too small to be effective. This led to flooding, which in turn weakened floorboards. More than one home was lost to gradual water damage, caused not by a single event, but 1,000 tiny leaks. And let's not forget the bathroom mirror. A symbol of vanity and modernity, yes, but also a frequent cause of injury. In homes with poor wall anchoring, mirrors fell. Shards pierced hands and feet. In a notable 1924 case, a Scottish woman bled to death after tripping on her bathroom rug and falling face first into the mirror mounted beside her tub. Storage posed yet another risk. In tight spaces, cabinets were often crammed high with toiletries, jars, and crockery. Overloaded shelves gave out. Heavy shaving mugs and hairbrushes fell. A child in Boston died in 1935 when a cabinet fell from the wall and struck his temple. The police described the scene as shockingly domestic. Even electricity brought problems. The early combination of water and wires was not well understood. Wall-mounted lamps shorted out. Improperly grounded light fixtures sparked fires. In homes with fused circuits, a single overloaded bulb could plunge the whole house into darkness. Mid-bath. It was not uncommon to hear screams in the night, followed by a sizzle and silence. For all its reputation as a place of respite, the bath was a minefield. And the bedroom, sanctuary though it may have seemed, was often just a soft coffin. Today, we've mitigated many of these dangers. Ground fault circuit interrupters, non-slip mats, fire-resistant bedding, structural inspections. But the echoes remain. The bedroom and the bathroom were never safe because the house itself was never safe. It was a beautiful illusion, fragile, flammable, and often fatal. So as you lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, or as you step into the bath, thinking only of warmth, spare a moment to remember others have done the same. And the house took them anyway. Part 6. The fire that danced through the drapes. Fire was the first gift of the home, and often the last thing anyone saw. Cooked meals, dried clothes, and warmed rooms. But it also killed swiftly and spectacularly. Long before we understood the chemistry of combustion, we lived side by side with open flame, trusting it to behave. History tells us it rarely did. For centuries, homes were packed with flammable material. Wood floors, straw-filled bedding, linen curtains, wool tapestries, wallpaper coated with arsenic-laced pigments and glues that burned with sickly green flames. And every home had at least one fire, usually more. Hearths burned all day, every day. Candles flickered in every corner. Oil lamps perched precariously on bedside tables and mantels. In this tinderbox environment, catastrophe was just one spark away. Take London, 1666. A baker's oven, poorly doused, sparked a blaze that swept across the city. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. The firestorm was so intense that lead roofing on churches melted and flowed like water. Eyewitnesses described the heat as biblical. But long before that great fire, small ones happened daily. Kitchen fires, chimney flares, curtain ignitions. Every Londoner lived with the knowledge that their home could vanish by morning. Women, again, bore much of the risk. Their skirts acted like wicks. In the Victorian era, women's crinoline dresses stood out nearly 3 feet from the body. When women passed too close to a fire or candle, the lower hem ignited first, then climbed upward, feeding on starch and fabric. The death toll was so consistent that newspapers stopped reporting individual cases unless they involved nobility. One such noble case, that of the Duchess of Abercorn in 1873, shocked polite society when she perished during a dinner party. She stood too close to the drawing room hearth. Her gown ignited. She died before the footmen reached her with the woolen blanket. Guests never returned to that house again. In kitchens, cooks contended with grease fires and coal flare-ups. Without proper hoods or chimneys, smoke filled rooms and reduced visibility, increasing the chance of burns or flare-induced blindness. One diary from 1829 recounts a scullery maid in York whose hair caught fire from a stove spark. She survived, but never returned to service. It was noted, "She sees God in every candle now." Fires didn't just kill, they maimed. Burns were among the most common injuries in 19th century hospitals, yet few treatments existed. Skin grafting was rare. Infection often followed. A simple brush with fire could lead to amputation days later. The rich tried to counter this with ornate fire guards and domestic staff assigned solely to monitor flames. But these measures failed often. In grand houses, hidden gas pipes used to light chandeliers could leak. One explosion in a manor outside Edinburgh leveled the entire West Wing. The owner survived. The valet didn't. Children were constantly at risk, left unattended. Many tried to imitate their parents, striking matches, playing with embers, or reaching into the fire to stoke it like they had seen done. A child's cotton nightshirt ignited instantly. In 1871, one school in Liverpool lost 3 students in a dormitory blaze started when a candle was knocked over during a midnight prank. Lighting itself was often the cause. Whale oil lamps, used extensively in the early 19th century, were unstable. If jostled, they spilled. If overheated, they burst. The smell of burning whale oil haunted the nostrils of entire generations. Then came kerosene, brighter and cheaper, but equally volatile. Entire neighborhoods burned from one toppled lamp. By the late 1800s, gaslight replaced oil in cities. Safer in theory, but gas fixtures leaked. One breath of gas could knock you unconscious. One spark could end you. In Paris in 1895, a theater collapsed into flame when a backstage gas lamp exploded. 70 people died. The culprit? A draft from an open door. Curtains, always curtains. Draped over windows and beds, they were made from thick fabrics. Velvet, cotton, wool that burned unpredictably. Their folds acted as funnels, drawing flames upward. More than one person died not from fire itself, but from smoke trapped in thick upholstery. Death by smothered velvet became a chilling shorthand in coroner's notes. And rugs. Oh, the rugs. Woolen floor coverings, once wet from mopping or snow boots, dried too close to the fire. They steamed, then smoked, then caught. The entire parlor could go up before anyone noticed. Insurance records from the 19th century reveal the depth of the crisis. In 1888, in Boston alone, over 1,200 domestic fires were reported. Many were contained. Dozens were not. Most began with bedding, drapery, or lighting devices. And fire brigades, where they existed, were often slow or lacked equipment. A bucket brigade couldn't save your parlor from a rug-fueled inferno. Attempts at prevention were noble but flawed. Fire screens reduced sparks but also reduced heat. Many removed them in winter. Water buckets were placed nearby, but froze in cold homes. In desperation, people poured sand or salt on small fires. It worked if the fire stayed small. In rural areas, help was even further away. If your home caught fire, you had minutes, maybe less. Many families kept their most precious items in a firebox near the door. Family Bibles, coins, marriage certificates. If the fire came, you grabbed the box and ran. Sometimes you didn't even make it that far. There are stories, whispers of fires started deliberately too. Insurance fraud, revenge, even accidental arson by those with mental illness or sleepwalking disorders. In one bizarre case in 1914, a man in Wales admitted to lighting his curtains ablaze in his sleep. He awoke outside in the snow with only his nightshirt and a scorched box of matches in his hand. Today, fireproofing is built into walls, fabrics, wiring. Smoke detectors blare. Sprinklers activate. Fire blankets sit folded in kitchens. But still, every year, homes burn. Every year, people die because something they trusted, light, heat, comfort, turned on them. We forget because we want to, but the house remembers. It remembers the flames. It remembers the fire that danced through the drapes. Part 7, the home as a hungry machine. We tend to imagine the home as a place of safety, the one space in the world designed to protect us from the elements, from violence, from the unknown. But if history has shown us anything, it is this. The house was never simply a shelter. It was a machine. And machines, when neglected, misused, or poorly designed, devour. The danger of the home was never just in one element. It was in the sum of its parts. We have spent thousands of years trying to make ourselves safe indoors, and in doing so, created complex ecosystems of interdependent hazards. Start with the staircase. For centuries, stairs were built not for grace, but for function. Steep, narrow, uneven, often little more than ladders with delusions of grandeur. In medieval castles, stairwells wound tightly in clockwise spirals to give sword-bearing defenders the advantage. That same spiral made daily life a test of balance, especially when carrying wood, water, or wine. In early modern homes, stairs were crammed into tight corners, with shallow treads and steep rises. Banisters, if present, were often decorative and untrustworthy. Children fell. Elderly relatives slipped. One London apothecary, writing in 1712, described his profession as half medicine, half treating bruises from stairs. In the 19th century, the grand staircase came into fashion, but looks were deceiving. Decorative railings broke under pressure. Carpeting slid loose. One court record from 1858 details a woman who sued her landlord after tripping on a loose stair runner and falling 2 stories. She lost the case. The judge ruled that a lady must mind her footing. Then there were cellars. Below the home, out of sight and often out of mind, they were spaces of both necessity and peril. In many homes, access was granted via a narrow staircase, often unlit and slick with moisture. Cellars housed coal, potatoes, wine, and sometimes death. One report from 1891 in Baltimore described a man who slipped carrying a sack of coal, knocked himself unconscious, and lay undiscovered for 2 days. He survived, barely, but others didn't. Children fell into cisterns. Housewives tripped while fetching pickles. Fires started in the coal bin and climbed upward. The cellar was both pantry and powder keg. Kitchens, too, were deceptively dangerous. Knives dulled and slipped. Rats bit in the dark. Entire homes filled with the smell of spoiled meat in the summer, which sometimes masked the scent of gas leaks. Iceboxes failed. Milk soured. Butter turned rancid. And if food didn't kill you, the stove might. Exploding pressure cookers. Collapsing chimney flues. Fires that started when fat spilled into coals. Then came electricity, the marvel, the miracle, the matchless killer. As early as the 1880s, homes began wiring for electric lights and appliances. But the materials were new, the standards non-existent. Wires frayed, insulation melted, sparks ignited wallpaper and wooden beams. In some cities, the fire department coined the term cord scorch to describe the signature smell of an electrical blaze. Extension cords ran under rugs. Outlets sparked. Fuse boxes overloaded. One Brooklyn apartment block experienced 3 electrical fires in a single week after residents all installed electric fans during a heat wave. The fans worked, but the walls glowed red. Water, too, was deceptive. Indoor plumbing, praised as a modern miracle, came with pipes that froze and burst. Toilets overflowed. Faucets dripped onto baseboards until the wood swelled and buckled. Water heaters exploded. And let's not forget lead, the poison leaching quietly from pipes into water, causing generations of children to suffer cognitive delays long before anyone understood why. Even the walls were not what they seemed. In the early 20th century, asbestos became a miracle material used in insulation, tiles, siding. Fireproof, durable, deadly. Asbestos fibers, when disturbed, lingered in the air and lodged in lungs. Entire neighborhoods were built from it, unaware that their homes were poisoning them slowly, invisibly, with every nail hammered and every hole drilled. In the post-war boom, synthetic materials became the norm. Plastic countertops, vinyl wallpaper, foam insulation. But when those burned, they released toxic gases. Firefighters in the 1970s noted that home fires were growing faster, hotter, and more toxic. Not because people were careless, but because the materials themselves had changed. Ventilation systems sucked in mold spores and blew them into every room. HVAC units shorted out. Ceiling fans loosened over time and fell like spinning blades. Garages filled with flammable chemicals. Laundry rooms flooded. Basements blackened with mildew. And then came the modern kitchen, clean, bright, deadly. Microwaves overheated. Dishwashers leaked. Garbage disposals jammed and bit back. Fridges shorted out and filled homes with burning plastic. One suburban neighborhood in California experienced 5 kitchen fires in 2 months, each traced back to the same model of electric stove. Even things meant to protect us sometimes turned against us. Fire alarms failed to go off. Carbon monoxide detectors went unwired. Smart home devices glitched. A man in Detroit was trapped inside his own house in 2021 when his security system locked him in during a power outage. His phone died. He kicked the door down to escape. All the while, the home remained quiet, creaked, it sighed, it hummed, it waited. We built homes to keep the world out. But in doing so, we created structures filled with hidden risks. We layered one technology on top of another, each with its own vulnerabilities. And we told ourselves we were safe. We are safer, but never safe. There are still ceiling beams that will crack, floors that will buckle, wires that will burn, pipes that will burst, curtains that will smolder, and houses that, for all their comfort and charm, will still eat the people who live inside them. So next time your wall groans, your light flickers, or your faucet spits, listen closely. That's not nothing. That's the house clearing its throat. And it may be hungry,